Branding. It's more than just logos, but we'll mostly talk about logos. This lecture will cover the basics, some of which are what is branding and why is it important, the differences between vector and raster graphics, where to use branding, kerning, common features in logos, and some prompts to help you make a logo. Branding is your logo, but it's also much more than that. It includes the name of your product, your signature color, the look and feel of your product, any associated imagery, and taglines. But for the purposes of this video, we're mostly going to be talking about logos. Branding your app or game is super important. Brands exist because they promote easy recognition of a product, which in turn promotes trust and brand loyalty. In the case of apps and games, however, properly executed branding is super important because it reflects on the quality of your app before the user ever even gets to try it out. If a potential user sees attractive, professional branding, they will think that the same care and attention probably went into creating the functionality and usability as went into creating the branding. They say you shouldn't judge a book by the cover, but in the App Store, that's basically the only thing a potential user has to go by when they decide whether or not they should download your app. Although in this case, instead of a cover, they're judging the app icon, screenshots, rating and reviews, name, and marketing copy, and probably in that order of importance. This idea can be summed up by the phrase, convert your project or hack into a product. In creating a brand, your hackathon hack or even long-term side project goes from being a project to becoming a product. As an example, here's a logo I made from my friend Masa's hackathon hack. The idea was pretty crazy. BitTorrent for physical objects. Instead of going out and buying 8 beats yourself, why not instead send a text message to all of your friends asking them how many beats they'll deliver to you? BitTorrent does that and provides a progress bar to the user that fills up as your friends respond to the invitations to deliver you free stuff with the number of things they're going to give you. Might sound crazy, but with that branding, it sure does look good. Here's another example. This is one of my all-time favorite hackathon ideas. Cranker is a simple solution to the problems inherent in making crank calls. It used to be that you'd have to have some specialized equipment to hook up a landline to a mixing board so that you could trigger funny Arnold Schwarzenegger clips from a sampler and record it all at the same time. Cranker solves that issue by providing the phone call, sound clip playback, and recording capabilities all in one app. Unfortunately, I spent more time relishing the idea and working on the branding than working on the actual hack itself. So it doesn't quite exist yet. But doesn't it look like a legitimate product? And if I'm honest, the logo probably didn't take more than 30 minutes to put together. So the value proposition for time invested in the logo is pretty great. Before we talk about some specifics of logo design, it's important to first talk about raster and vector graphics. Raster graphics are the more common form that you will encounter. JPEGs, PNGs, and GIFs are all raster graphic formats. They work by storing the color values of each pixel. Some formats, like PNG, are lossless, which means they retain all of the pixel information stored into them. Other formats, like JPEG and GIF, are lossy. They selectively throw away information to make the file size smaller. Interestingly, despite being lossless, PNGs often have smaller file sizes than comparable JPEGs for things like logos. Simple lines and shapes with large blocks of the same color. That's because PNGs also compress data, but they do it similar to the way zip compression works, so that the original data can be fully restored. And those algorithms do well when there's large amounts of repeated data, like many pixels having the exact same color. So for raster renders of logos, prefer PNGs. Also, PNGs can have transparency, whereas JPEG and GIF cannot. JPEG compression is better for things like photos where there's thousands or potentially millions of colors. Sure, it will throw some or even a lot of the data away, depending on the compression setting, but the files will be much smaller than comparable PNGs or other lossless formats. Although your logo might eventually be exported and displayed as a raster graphic, you never want to design it as one. Because each pixel is stored individually, they cannot be resized, especially enlarged, without losing quality. You want to design your logo as a vector, which can be resized infinitely without loss of quality, but we'll talk about that in a bit. The most common piece of professional-grade software for manipulating raster graphics is Adobe Photoshop. Pixelmator is a slightly less powerful but far cheaper alternative for Mac only. GIMP is free and open source. Like many pieces of open source software, it is more cumbersome to use than its commercial counterparts and may lack some more advanced features, but it's truly free, which is great. Here, as an example of what not to do, are some logos that were designed as rasters. This is a logo for my high school marching band. I don't mind the colors or the form and weight of the text, but it was made during my mid-2000s grunge design phase, also known as when I figured out that there were free grunge brushes on the internet that could be installed into Photoshop. This is bad for two reasons. Those brushes are samples of textures that were photographed and are therefore inherently rasters, which means that this logo is also a raster and will not resize well. Also, grunge design may have been trendy at one point, but it isn't any longer, which means that this logo looks dated at best and "that's gross, I can't believe that was ever a thing" at worst. Here's a second grungy logo made for a project in a college programming class. We made a synthesizer for a toy CPU, so naturally the project was called Synthocalypse. Both of these logos are less than ideal. They can't be made to look good small because they're too busy with detail, none of which would be comprehensible small. They can't be made bigger because they were designed as rasters and therefore cannot be enlarged without losing quality. Now let's talk about vector formats. Instead of storing individual pixels, vector formats store information as equations, lines and shapes of colors. Because they're stored as equations, they're infinitely resizable. That makes them the best format for print where really high-resolution images are necessary. That also makes it the best format to design a logo in because the logo will often need to be resized and adapted for various media, one of which is print, which needs a vector logo for the best quality. The most common vector graphic format encountered on the web is SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. For design work, vectors are often stored as .ai, which is a proprietary Adobe Illustrator format, or the more portable EPS format. However, sometimes EPS files created by Illustrator are not so portable because they contain non-standard Illustrator data in them, which is a tricky way for Adobe to ensure that you pay for Illustrator to open and edit the files. The most common piece of professional software for editing vector files is Adobe Illustrator. Sketch is very nice and a much cheaper alternative that can create and manipulate vector files and is really good for designing apps and logos. It's also pretty easy to use. Inkscape is free and open source, and like GIMP can be cumbersome to use, but hey, it's free. Here's an example of an SVG and a small part of the code from the SVG file used to generate it. You may notice that SVG is actually an XML data format. Here's a logo I designed for a house I was living in with a bunch of other performing arts technology majors, the Pat House. This one was made correctly as a vector, which is good. Assuming you've got a logo made, where should it appear in your app or game? After all, it would be a waste for it not to appear all over your app or game so that your users don't forget the product they're using. Well, not so fast. For one thing, the user clicked your icon, which should be a branded element, and below it they saw your app's name, so they're not going to suddenly forget which app they're in. And importantly, you don't want to hinder or even ruin the user's experience by being obtrusive with your branding. For an app, maybe your logo could appear on the launch screen as the app is loading. Or maybe it appears as a title in the root view controller navigation bar. You could also incorporate part of your brand's identity by making your navigation bar color match the signature color of your brand. Or maybe your branding doesn't really feature heavily in the app at all, which is totally okay. An important part of your branding mission was accomplished when it convinced the user to download the app in the first place, and they're interacting with your brand every time they click your icon. So it's not as if you're in danger of having the user forget about your app once they're inside of it. Apple's Human Interface Guidelines state the following: incorporate a brand's assets in a refined, unobtrusive way. You want to quietly remind users of the brand identity through your choice of font, color, and imagery. Let's look at some examples of this. Here's Dropbox's iPad app. Their logo features both the box symbol and the words Dropbox, but for their app icon, they've decided to go with just the box, which was a smart choice for a clean, symbolic identity. Attempting to incorporate logo type into an app icon will often result in a cluttered design. The launch screen is a mock layout of the root view controller, just without content filled in. This is actually a trick recommended by Apple and used in many of the iOS system apps to make the app feel like it's loading faster. Notice the subtle Dropbox logo in the right-hand content pane in the launch screen. But also notice how, aside from some subtle blue colors, the Dropbox branding doesn't appear anywhere in the app itself. Here's the Twitch iPad app. The icon is Twitch's social media symbol called Glitch, which if I had to guess is a chat bubble. Chat is an extremely important part of the Twitch platform. So important, in fact, that it turns Twitch from a platform into a community, which is a great way to isolate Twitch's product and business from its competitors. Interestingly, Glitch doesn't appear in their logo next to the Twitch text, which we can see in the launch screen. We can see that Twitch chose not to go with the mock UI layout for their launch screen, instead opting for a nice bold logo in the middle of a purple field. They traded perhaps the perception of a small loading speed increase instead for more brand awareness. The Twitch logo doesn't appear at all in the main screen of the app, but can be seen at the top of the navigation drawer that shows after clicking the hamburger button. Twitch has done an excellent job of incorporating their signature purple color throughout the lifecycle of the app, from helping the user to find the icon in their home screen, to the boldly colored launch screen, and finally by incorporating it without being overbearing by coloring the navigation bar. For comparison, here's the Netflix iPad app. Interestingly, Netflix has no symbol associated with the logo, instead opting for just the stylized text. At one point, the red Netflix mailer envelopes containing DVDs were important and strongly associated with the brand, but as that part of the business is phased out, so will the associated identity. The Netflix red color works very nicely on both white and black, as demonstrated by the fact that the icon is white and the launch screen is black. If I had to guess, the icon is white because it stands out better that way. Don't forget that every icon exists in a sea of competing icons both in the App Store and on the home screen. The dark launch screen serves as a nice transition point from the OS into the app, which has a dark theme. The dark theme is nice because it provides a really nice contrast for the TV and movie posters populating the app, allowing the user to better focus on the most important thing, the content. Notice that the Netflix branding is more apparent in this app compared to the others, appearing right in the middle of the navigation bar, but it's small enough to not be too intrusive. Now let's take a look at a game, Cut the Rope HD Free Edition. This game follows a very common pattern for games. It features the main character in the icon. For many games, that will be a large and highly detailed face, although in this case, it's a cartoon character. It features the publisher in the launch screen and the game's logo at the top of the lobby. It's often important to establish publisher and game studio identities within games because game studios tend to have many more products, games, that they would like their user to play. And if the user has positive feelings about one game, maybe they'll look for more by the same company. Or, put another way, many app companies offer a service and will have one main branded app. That's the case for Dropbox, Twitch, and Netflix, all of which share the same branding between the app and the company. But game studios have their own branding, and each game made by the game studio will have its own associated branding. Before we talk about some specifics involved in logo construction, let's take a look at kerning, because it turns out to be very important when constructing a logo. Kerning is quite simply adjusting the space between characters to achieve an aesthetically pleasing result. The top word can be said to have loose kerning, the middle one normal, and the bottom one tight. There's two forms for logos that are quite common: thin text and loosely kerned, and bold text and tightly kerned. Standard font weights at their normal kerning don't tend to make great logos. It looks too much like body text. Bold text tightly kerned is the most common form. Here's a logo I made for a series of photos I shot at Lake Tahoe. This photo in particular is very light and airy. 3/4 of it is sky, and it's intentionally processed to be low contrast. I thought that a thin type with loosely kerned characters would match the aesthetic of the photo. This is Hero Thin, loosely kerned. This is a logo that I made for my music. My former artist name was Prelinger. I tend to go through them because rebranding is an opportunity to design new logos, which I think tends to be fun. This is Ubuntu Bold, tightly kerned. I should point out that when designing logos, very commonly each character will be kerned individually, the spacing between each character tweaked to achieve the best result. Kerning isn't always easy. Sometimes things can go horribly wrong. When it does, it's called kemming. Bad kerning can lead to many hilarious results, many of which can be seen on the internet. Here's one of the more appropriate ones. Why watch burn notice when there's bum notice? There's a really great kerning game in which the left and rightmost characters of a word are fixed, and it's up to you, the amateur typographer, to properly kern the characters in between. You can find it at http://type.method.ac. Let's talk about some things to consider when designing your logo. You should experiment with serif and sans serif typefaces. You should construct all caps, all lowercase, and mixed case variations to see which looks best. Sometimes all caps can look stronger, and all lowercase can feel friendlier, with mixed case, in which the first character is capitalized, being in between. It's important to only use typefaces designed by professional type designers for your logo. They're professionals because they're good at what they do, ensuring that the proportions are consistent from character to character. They spend a long time working on the kerning table, which defines the amount of space that should be between each of the character pairs. For example, how much space should there be between an O and an E? What about O and R? In the case of professionally designed typefaces, those proportions have been carefully considered by the type designer, and that effort will improve your logo. Some general considerations for when designing your logo. The colors should work nicely on both light and dark backgrounds. Remember the Netflix example? In that case, the red looks good on both, but sometimes it may mean having alternate color schemes for your logo depending on the background it appears on. For example, the Make School logo in the bottom right has white text because it's on a dark background, but when the logo appears on light gray and white backgrounds, it should have blue text. In general, you should avoid gradients as they don't tend to print very well. Logos should also be able to work both in horizontal and vertical contexts. This is called having both horizontal and vertical lockups. Honestly, this is less important as you're starting out designing your logo because you'll control the contexts it appears in. But for reference, here's the Make School logo in its vertical lockup, horizontal lockup, and graphical symbol only forms. The three forms that a logo can take are graphic symbol only, symbol and text only. There are very few companies that can use only the symbol part of their logo and retain international brand recognition. Nike is one. The other major one? Apple. So now, as an exercise, you should make a logo. If you feel like you've already learned enough to attempt one, then great. But if you feel like you could use some more guidance, then fear not, for I shall teach you the secret of the Helvetica logo. Pick a single color. Write out your name in that color using Helvetica Bold. Tighten the kerning, and then optionally add a vector symbol. For free for commercial use vector icons, visit http://www.sethbird.com/icons. Why Helvetica? Why does this work? Because so many of the logos you encounter every day are Helvetica Bold, and you've just become used to associating it with a logo. These 9 companies' logos are all Helvetica Bold, and this is just a small sampling of the vast amount of Helvetica logos. Even the word Helvetica by itself looks like a logo. Here it is with its normal kerning, but tighten the kerning, and it looks even more like a logo. Isn't that interesting? Remember the BitTorrent logo from the beginning? Yep, it's Helvetica Bold, tighten kerning with a graphic symbol.